forward to this because all things CIA-ish are always an interesting road or rabbit hole to go down. Welcome to the Unrefined Podcast, where we unravel the mysteries of life, challenge the status quo, and explore the supernatural through a biblical perspective. I'm your host, Brandon Spain, along with Lindsay Waters. We invite you to stay connected and discover how to access exclusive content by visiting unrefinedpodcast.com. Now, let's begin this week's journey. All right, you guys. We are back for another definitely interesting episode, man. I've been really looking forward to this because all things CIA-ish are always an interesting road or rabbit hole to go down. Some stories, though, are too dangerous for the headlines, and some deaths, well, too suspicious to be coincidence. In today's episode, we're pulling back the curtain on a hidden war, one fought not with bullets, but with needles, pills, media manipulation. From the psychedelic revolution to crack epidemic, from Lennon to Cobain to Tupac, what if the counterculture wasn't just infiltrated, but deliberately dismantled? The patterns are there, the names are familiar, and the implications are massive. Joining us today is someone who's followed this paper trail, connected the dots, and dared to say the quiet part out loud. Welcome to our show, John Potash. Thank you, John, for coming on our show. We appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on, Brandon and Lindsay.
Yeah. Wow. We've done a series before, about a year, actually, where we went pretty deep into Laurel Canyon. But before we dive into all the details, your documentary just blew me away. I mean,
thank you.
The CIA, we're that kind of podcast. We see very little good coming out of the CIA. I almost wonder if it's like the deep state for the world or something. But anyway, so what first led you, though, to jump into this connect drugs and covert government operations, specifically targeting musicians and activists? I know there's been MKULTRA and a lot of this kind of stuff, but what got you going into this?
Well, I definitely had a drug problem in high school, and I didn't think that much of it. But then when I was in my first year of college and I was a little overly confident with being able to just read things a little bit and do fine in school, I took maybe half dozen hits of acid over the course of my freshman year, and I realized that I just did something really bad to my brain. I was still kind of programmed to think that, well, acid's not bad because it was part of the 60s that led to the anti-war movement and all that. And I really believed that stuff at that time. But I did know for sure that I lost so many abilities after a half dozen hits of acid that something ugly was going on, whether it was the acid itself or the strychnine it was cut with, and strychnine's rat poison and a lot of acid cut with it. It was doing something real bad to my brain. I got away from that. I dabbled in everything when I was an abuser, but when I got away from a lot of those drugs, I was lucky to get away without 12-step programs. I guess a lot of people who get addicted do need 12-step programs. Things did get better in general with my learning, but it took about a year, and some abilities just never quite came back. But so I still just was doing random study on it with some papers in college. But I didn't really think that much of any kind of purposeful use of the drugs to undermine things like the anti-war movement and civil rights movement until I came across a book called Acid Dreams. And at that point, I realized, okay, the CIA was purposely using acid to undermine the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And now that book has been manipulated a bit in terms of putting a forward in there that suggested otherwise by the publisher and things. But it really does come across as, okay, well, there's something nefarious going on here. And the CIA was behind the rise and the push of LSD, like in a huge way.
Yeah. John, who wrote the Acid Dreams book?
Yeah, Acid Dreams was by Martin Lee and Bruce Schlain, and it came out in the 1980s. I think came out first in one version in Britain, maybe in 1986, and then it came out in the U.S., I believe, in the early, maybe 1990 or so. After reading that book, and then I read a magazine regularly called Covert Action Quarterly, which was started by a CIA whistleblower named Phil Agee. And I was getting more activist after college when I'd given up my activism in college because after hurting my brain, with the drugs, I had to work a little harder to get good grades and stuff, a lot harder at first. And then slowly after about a year, things started coming back stronger. with my abilities. After college, I got into activism in a bigger way, anti-war activism and civil rights activism. And I was working as an addictions counselor in Baltimore City. And people I was counseling said, my parents were like, one said my father was killed by the police. He was a Black Panther. So I was investigating that a bit. And others said, well, everyone knows that that the Black community doesn't have the boats and the planes to get in the drugs, the crack into our communities and the heroin into our communities. And so it's got to be the government that's bringing it in. And so before I became an addictions counselor, I actually worked for just 6 months as a parole and probation officer, and just to pay the bills. It was hard to pay the bills. And I did come across massive corruption amongst the communities that were kind of overlapping, were getting off in court, and people that were connected to politics. And so I investigated that more, and I ended up wanting to write a novel, ended up turning into the book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA War Musicians and Activists. And I just took the stance that musicians that we love were kind of first, they were manipulated to promote drugs a bit, but then when they sobered up and started promoting sobriety, they were done away with. And as you say, it relates to Cobain, Tupac a bit with the weed, even though Tupac was stayed away from the other drugs that people got, like U.S. intelligence got his mother involved with the crack. Jimi Hendrix and John Lennon were the main ones, but the Rolling Stones also, and some others, Janis Joplin and people. Yeah. So I investigated that way because those musicians are the ones that appeal to our hearts and minds, and that's what the CIA wants to do. They know they can't control us by force because there's too many of us. The 99% of us are too many, but they want to control our hearts and minds to think that we're acting on our own best interests when we're actually acting on their interest and not realizing that we're being manipulated. And so when musicians threaten to take kind of sway us their way to be anti-war, pro-civil rights, and away from what the CIA wants us to believe, then they're a threat to them. They're a threat to the CIA's agenda. And of course, the CIA, I argue, and I show the evidence of, really just kind of foot soldiers for and are part of the wealthiest oligarchs, the wealthiest, families in the country, if not the world. The Morgans of J.P. Morgan fame, the Rockefellers who own Chase Bank that merged to be JP Morgan Chase, largest bank in the world. Those folks, they put their own family members in the leadership of the U.S. intelligence from the start when the CIA was formed in 1947 with the National Security Act of 1947. And this comes from places like Frances Stoner Saunders, The Cultural Cold War. She was a British magazine editor. And it comes from Victor Marchetti, who wrote CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, and he was one of the highest level whistleblowers who happened to be Catholic because they didn't let any minorities into the highest leadership positions. He got the closest of anyone being Catholic. Everyone else was wealthy white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Yeah. Many of them from the families, the wealthiest families, or their lawyers, like Alan Dulles, who was a lawyer for the J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller interests. So the Dulles brothers both were lawyers for those interests, and that's why they had such big positions. Like his brother John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State for a while. So this is how they got their power. And then, of course, in the early 1950s is when they started the MKULTRA program, and we'll get into that in a moment, I'm sure.
Yeah, Montauk. And none of this surprises me at all, John, because, I mean, look, I have a unique, that I'm not going to get on the show about, a unique connection to Mena, Arkansas, and the whole Boys on the Tracks, and the whole, CIA smuggling drugs out, and the whole Iran-Contra thing back during Reagan. And, so it shouldn't surprise us that the CIA is doing this stuff, but yet they continue to put out, this is where an interest of ours that we really like is predictive program. They continue to put out movies and media material that make the CIA the good guys,
right?
And that they're really fighting for America and all this kind of crap. How did you dive into a lot of this research? Did you use like FOIA stuff, or did it mostly involve whistleblowers? I mean, who were your sources that you can reveal?
Yeah. I mean, it started with, the Tupac part of that Drugs as Weapons Against Us book ended up becoming my first book because I got so much information from people that just wanted to open up and explain. Like I cold called his lawyer when he was like within a few days of him being shot in a New York record recording studio. And his lawyer and I said, well, I'm trying to write an article. I'm a freelance, writer trying to write an article for Covert Action Quarterly and or Z Magazine and some of these national activist magazines. And he knew those magazines. And he knew no one was talking about this subject. So he gave me an hour to, interview on the subject. He says, yeah, nobody's talking about this, that he's being targeted. Tupac's being targeted by what appears to be a latter-day counterintelligence program, FBI counterintelligence program, which targeted people that were anti-war or for civil rights and things like that.
Yeah.
So I tried to publish an article in Covert Action Quarterly at the time, but they had someone I believe it was a plant that literally, when I went into the Covert Action Quarterly office in Washington, D.C., where I was living at the time, this guy put his arm around me and led me out. He said, no, we just have to talk out here. And I was about to hand a copy of my article, which I'd already sent to them, but I hadn't heard any feedback on it. And I was about to give a copy and to hand it to a guy named Lou Wolf, who was one of the co-publishers. And so he leads me out of there and says, we just can't publish this at this time. And he leads me to some small zine in the area. And I end up publishing it in there because no one else would publish at the time. People were too brainwashed about Tupac just being this gangster versus being an activist. And the gangster was just a persona he was putting on with the, as part of the gang peace truce movement to get the Bloods and Crips to call peace truces and turn on to activism. And so he's pretending to be this gangster in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them that way. And that came from his mentor, former LA Panther named Watani Tayahemba, is a lifetime mentor of his and first-time business manager of Tupac's. But so I did a long interview with him later. But I also talked to John, was giving a lecture in 1990 where I was living at that time in Baltimore City, and he was lecturing at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and he told me, that his fellow CIA officers, told him, they were flying, the heroin from Vietnam into the United States, and he was a great whistleblower and did a lot of great work and talked about it in this lecture a bit, but told me, firsthand when I talked to him right after the lecture. And so those were some of my whistleblowers. The Covert Action Quarterly, again, had some great articles from some CIA whistleblowers interviewed. I ended up publishing the Tupac article later, a few years later. First published that in the zine in 1995 before he died. And then a few years later, published a much bigger, more expanded article after interviewing Watani Tayahemba and Tupac's national lawyer, Chokwe Lumumba, and people like that. So those were some of my first sources. And then when I came out with Drugs as Weapons Against Us, I talked at length to Courtney Love's father, Hank Harrison, her biological father. He had put out a kind of PDF book that I believe, I forget the name of it now. I think it was called Love Kills, or maybe a different name at that time. So he sent it for free to some people that he knew were investigating like he was. And, he came up with, it was very long, but I just read the whole thing and just took notes where I thought, okay, these are some gems from this book. It was a bit long and rambling, but there were some gems in there that were really important. And I just said, okay, can you give me your sources for this information? And so he gave me the sources, and then I found second sources to that information that backed what he said, that basically said that he, CIA, basically a U.S. intelligence agent named Stephen O'Leary, basically got into his life when he was doing research in Dublin for a book, and then became part of Courtney's life. Started having sex with her when she had just turned 17 and was visiting her father, took her over to England, introduced her to a bunch of bands, places like Manchester, Liverpool, places like that. And she proceeded to disrupt tons of these bands. And
I believe Echo and the Bunnymen.
Exactly, Echo and the Bunnymen, right?
Yep.
Right. So when she did that, and that was in the 1980s, and she was basically duplicating what was done in 1965 by an assistant, MKULTRA director named Robert Lashbrook. He brought in 1965, January 65 or so, he came over with tons of LSD, tons of cash, and tons of agents. And according to Ernest Hemingway's editor, A.E. Hotchner, who wrote a book on that era with the Rolling Stones and Britain called Blown Away, he said he just, he was trying to get acid in as many musicians' hands as possible.
Is that when they set up the clinic in San Francisco where they were trying to get it out, or
So that was a little later. That was about 67 or so.
Okay,
They set up that Haight-Ashbury free clinic.
the Haight-Ashbury,
clinic.
yeah.
But before that, there was loads, Acid Dreams documented how there was loads of CIA agents throughout San Francisco, and they were getting the acid all over Haight-Ashbury and other parts of San Francisco, but mainly Haight-Ashbury was a hotbed for that, experimenting with the acid. When they were actually doing it starting in about 1960 or 61, actually, in the San Francisco Bay Area in general, because they were targeting, they didn't like the Berkeley free speech movement. Okay.
Yeah.
And they wanted to target those activists. And that was, their first target. And so by 1963 or 4, it was, their MKUltra had started in 1953, I'll say. And that was the CIA's kind of umbrella project for how to use drugs as weapons against us. And the MKUltra documents, which the CIA director Helms tried to shred, completely and get rid of them all against the law. You're not allowed to shred government documents. They're supposed to be open to the public. He tried to shred them all, but they found, 10, maybe 20,000 of them, 10 to 20,000 of them in the accounting records that he didn't shred. And so those are the source of a lot of material, although they say there's about top researchers say there's about 10 times or 20 times many pages in the that were already shredded. But nonetheless, they were holding the MKUltra experiments using psychedelics like psychedelic mushrooms and acid, and they were giving them for free. I mean, actually, they were paying students in about 45 colleges around the country, 40 plus prisons, and number of hospitals to take these drugs. Like Timothy Leary was probably the most famous professor who was running a project.
Guy. Yep.
Yeah, but him,
the apostle of it.
Yeah. Right, the apostle of it, right. And so they were, given the acid there, and then when they were kicked out of Harvard, they ended up starting a constant party in a place called Millbrook Mansion, which was owned by a guy named Mellon Hitchcock. Mellon Hitchcock had a sister, Peggy Mellon Hitchcock. It was Billy Mellon Hitchcock and his sister, Peggy Mellon Hitchcock, who were part of a group that Leary started with the funding from the Mellon Hitchcocks. And the Mellon Hitchcocks were owners of Gulf Oil, Mellon Bank, sponsored Carnegie Mellon University, places like that. And so they were super wealthy, connected to the oligarchs of the Rockefellers, the JP Morgans, and all of them. Yeah. And so they were also high up in intelligence. Their families were high up in intelligence. And so, they funded this constant party at Millbrook Mansion that pretended to be the black sheep of the family and that there was all grassroots stuff. But they were luring a bunch of musicians and activists from New York City to come up an hour north to this Millbrook Mansion for this constant party. And who was in that constant party? There was these U.S. intelligence, agents, MKUltra agents, just experimenting with all kinds of crazy psychedelics, like super strong BZ or STP. They're much stronger even than acid, and luring these musicians up there, and even the comedian Groucho Marx was lured up there reportedly.
Wow.
And they messed up their heads. Yeah, they messed up their minds with all these crazy drugs. And so I show that the largest number of activists that went down to Freedom Summer civil rights movement under Martin Luther King came from New York City. And a lot of them were lured up there, sadly enough, and their minds were hurt. Now, the parallel to that was on the West Coast, where they convinced Ken Kesey, the writer, when he was at the Stanford Writing Institute, when he was like in grad school for writing. He, the novelist, he ends up for some money. He was a serious wrestler and was, I think, an alternate at one point on an Olympic team at one point. But he was a serious wrestler. He didn't do any drugs at all. He just drank a bit, but he just needed the money, and so they paid him about $100, $150, which was a lot in that time in the early '60s. And he went and did the experiment at Stanford Hospital that got him high on acid. And then he got a job there right afterwards, and they supposedly allowed him to steal the acid from their supply. And he threw constant parties with that acid. And then some people around him, many who were in the military, a number of them were in the military, just come out of the military, and they called themselves the Merry Pranksters. They convinced him to paint a bus in Dayglow colors, an old school bus in Dayglow colors, And so when a lot of those free speech activists from Cal Berkeley and other places, when they formed a bus to join the Freedom Summer Martin Luther King civil rights movement in the Mississippi area, South area,
Yeah.
the same day that their bus left to join the Freedom Summer movement, the psychedelic bus left, and to be part of that, to like follow them, basically, not to be part of it, but to follow them.
Yeah.
And they ended up going through all these hotbeds of civil rights activism with their psychedelic bus promoting acid and other drugs. And so I don't even know if I got that. I think that might have been cut from the most recent film, or it might be, because I just didn't have enough space for it. But that's just another aspect of how that worked. I do have it in my book, of course. I think at least part of it, not the exact detail of them leaving the exact same day. But it's hard to include everything because you just have so much space in films and books to make them, people want to buy a book about 800 pages or 900 pages. Nonetheless, and so they were they were kind of another CIA acid promoting kind of group, sadly enough. And poor Ken Kesey was just manipulated to be part of that. And when he tried to back out of it, they came down on him to try to arrest him and send him off. And he tried to escape to Mexico and et cetera. And that's it. They kept going without him.
That's what blows my mind about this whole ordeal is the CIA. It's so compartmentalized. You have different groups in the CIA doing different things, and they're doing contra things with each other. But it just blows me away. From them, we did a lot of deep research on how they tried to start the countercultural movement to see if they could manipulate movements and stuff. But then, yet, like what you say, at the same time, and I was just talking to Lindsay about this before the show, and I wanted to ask you about this before we get deep into some of the other stuff. There was this video that circulated about Tupac that basically alluded to the fact, I'm sure you've seen it, that alluded to the fact that he was some sort of a crisis actor, that he was in the video. It was implied that he was gay, and then he was a pizza delivery guy, and then they hired him to become the persona of Tupac.
I've never heard of this video, but it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, you don't ever know. I mean, it is older, so the less likely it is to be a deep fake is there, but I still don't know. You have no way of knowing, and I'm not an expert graphics guy. I wish I could find it. I'll email it to you. But I was telling Lindsay, I said, no matter what happens, I think a lot of these stars got into it and were manipulated by the CIA, like you said, to be assets. And then they woke up, so to speak, and realized what were happening. And then they were boop, pulled out of it, particularly a lot of the 60s, the 70s guys, I think.
Yeah, no, it's interesting what you said about the Tupac situation. I could see them trying to do that for sure. And he was engaged to be married to Kadada Jones, which was Quincy Jones's daughter.
Yeah.
So before he died. And so, didn't happen to be gay. He was liberal minded, and they tried to present him as homophobic. He went to the Boston School for the Arts. But so it's fun. It's crazy what they'll do to try to just smear people and all that, like to pretend like he's a crisis actor. I mean, no, he was an actor, of course. He did that for a living. He made some great films, but and the only other way he was acting outside of films, as I said, was just to pretend to be more of a gangster than he really was. He was really an intellectual. He rewrote Shakespeare in high school and performed it. He produced it, performed it, starred in it. And to make it into modern language. So he's just a brilliant guy. He just pretended to be something else than he really was.
Yeah, which makes sense. And then those time periods, it was turbulent, and that's how you would do it. But yeah, and I thought about that. That video could just be something thrown out there to discredit. Which,
probably.
But I just wanted to ask you about if you had heard about it or seen it or anything like that.
I'd like to see it. Thanks.
Yeah, Lindsay, you had a question you were about to ask.
Yeah, well, yeah. We may as well. So we're talking about this. We may as well talk about the Grateful Dead and kind of your view of them and how they played into this whole,
or even widespread panic, which is a newer version of the Grateful Dead.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so when I was in high school, I was bought into just liking whoever people were playing. So I saw maybe 14 Grateful Dead shows. I enjoyed myself there and all, but when I started like realizing what acid did to me and seeing what it was doing to these people at the shows, I was like, this is ugly. I'm not as into this But I might have seen another show after that, maybe once or twice. And then I ended up reading about researching and finding out what I found out. And when I met a guy who said he was an acid dealer who got his acid from the top, meaning Jerry and Bob Weir, Jerry Garcia, the lead singer of Grateful Dead, Bob Weir, the lead guitarist and stuff, people like them. I thought, no, this is too much. The only time I'll go to a show now would be as a study of what's going on here and how people are so messed up. And so it's just a shame. I think they were probably, they were the first band to play for the acid test in those areas. That was an MKULTRA experiment to spread acid like crazy, promote it like crazy to people. And they had tubs full of acid with Kool-Aid that are spiked with acid and big trash cans full of Kool-Aid spiked with acid just to give it to people when they didn't. Yeah, some people knew it was acid in there. Some people didn't.
Well, and people would overheat from dancing, and all you had to drink there was the Kool-Aid. Is kind of what happened a lot of times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's a shame. Yeah, it's a shame that even though I like their music, I was like, I can't like them because they took part in this stuff. Yeah, it's too shame. Too bad.
When I found out some stuff, Laurel Canyon and some of the players out there that were involved in intelligence and were just plants out there to start stuff. There's one guy in particular. We interviewed a survivor on our show of MKULTRA and just basically ritual abuse type stuff.
Wow,
and
terrible.
I like this guy. I mean, he was the mentor, one of my favorite guitarists in the whole world, and I was just like, I just can't listen to his music anymore. It's just sitting in your head there, like,
right.
So I understand exactly.
Who was the person you couldn't listen to anymore?
Zappa.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And now Zappa, the only good thing I'll say about Zappa is it was terrible what he did with all those parties, doing exactly what the others were doing in Laurel Canyon in terms of sex and drug parties to push and promote drugs on all these actors and musicians. So that was terrible. But he did start to become a whistleblower, it seemed, in the sense that he did reveal on this Alan Handelman show, and Alan Handelman told me this when he interviewed me, back when I first came out with the book in 2015. And he said, Frank Zappa was the first person to tell me, the CIA's giving acid to the hippies and then arrested them at night. But so he started to become a little bit of a whistleblower, I do believe, at least later in life. And, maybe he did some better stuff later, even though at the time he was obviously doing ugly stuff for his father. He worked at Edgewood Arsenal in my area in Maryland. Creating all these drugs. So
Montauk. I mean, a lot of them. It's amazing how many of them were all intelligence. And I even looked up a lot of it, not believing David McGowan. I believed him, but I wanted to go, and it was legit, man.
That's smart. I think it's worth researching behind our backs, seeing if what you can find actually works with it or doesn't work with it. But I do think McGowan was brilliant. Just really brilliant for this stuff. He came out with stuff fast. He did good research. I think he was great, and it's really sad to lose him. I was going back and forth with emails with him before he died, and it's just really sad to lose him.
Well, let me ask you this. So in what ways do you believe the CIA used psychedelics and other substances to control and neutralize the perceived threats? I mean, how deep did this rabbit hole go, so to speak?
Well,
what was their plan?
With the musicians used it, they found their own studies. And what I found is they found that the acid like weakened some kind of emotional control or something else in our brains that allowed for easier manipulation. And then, when they tried to get away from the acid, of course, the heroin or cocaine or other drugs like that caused more physical control because of relapse symptoms, just the withdrawal symptoms, and all that stuff. And so I think that they did that, like with Janis Joplin, they, FBI agent entered her life, according to his own reports. He worked for the FBI and developed a speed problem with her. When you got someone hooked on speed, when you got someone hooked on heroin, it's like clear physiological control because of withdrawal symptoms are so intense. With the acid, it's easier just to manipulate them in their minds. But even with weed, as I pointed out with Tupac, when he developed that weed problem, it was easy. They lured him somewhere, and he was really alert and sharp to say, okay, I got to watch out for perceived threats. But they lured him into that studio and shot him 3 times. And he said, if I wasn't so stoned, I would have known something's wrong here, and I wouldn't have entered that recording studio. That's some of the way they did. It was a recording studio lobby in Times Square.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, those are some of the ways that they did that, and they kind of got them. Probably people like I liked Jefferson Starship and Grace Slick and people, but
Yeah.
she was, her head was a bit messed up on this stuff, and she was so talented. But she obviously promoted acid with like I think it was called White Rabbit or whatever that song was, promoting acid, and so it's a
I just got
shame
that march drum beat in my head as soon as you said the song.
yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah, we're big time audiophiles, man. I mean, music is that's one of our attractions to getting you on the show is we
I'm
love
glad.
music. 50s on. So, but
Yeah.
um so all right, let's talk a little bit about John Lennon in this equation. How did he get pulled into this? I don't want you to give your whole book away, but
Oh, that's okay. Yeah,
yeah.
no, but Lennon's there's a lot of theories on Lennon, and I couldn't get into the deepest ones that he was manipulated from the very start with
Was it
like speed and
Yoko?
stuff.
Was Yoko involved
But
in
but
this?
yeah, there's some theories that I didn't touch on, which I started to, and I had to cut out of my film that
Yeah.
the Beatles were kind of manufactured to divert people's attention from the Warren Commission and
Yeah.
the
Like the
assassination
monkeys.
of President Kennedy. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so part of this, all these bands are a distraction, but Lennon was obviously really talented, brilliant guy. Him and the Beatles in general were talented with great pop songs, but they, yeah, I definitely think that they tried to, people tried to sway them, had them come into the United States with the Beatlemania and distract from the investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy, which was certainly by the oligarchs and deep state, CIA,
Yep.
whatever.
Yep.
And and so you got that going on, and then you got Beatlemania, and then so John Lennon starts making some anti-war statements, and as I say, Robert Lashbrook in 1965 comes into London with all this acid and agents and money, and that's when George Harrison's dentist, George Harrison, the guitarist of the Beatles, for people that don't remember, young people, but he has them over, John Lennon and George Harrison over, and doses their coffee with acid.
Oh my
And
gosh.
then when John Lennon and George Harrison are over in the United States and with the Beatles are first time like another time, I mean, visiting the United States for touring, David Van Cortlandt Crosby, and I say his middle name because Van Cortlandt's one of the wealthiest families in New York. They then convinced them with Peter Fonda there at the party and other people to try acid a second time, even though the first time was involuntary when they were dosed with it in their coffee, and they were pissed off, and George Harrison didn't even know what acid was when he got that first hit of acid.
Yeah.
And so this is the way they manipulated them to promote acid with their like magical mystery tour, replicating the Ken Kesey bus, Merry Pranksters bus, I should say.
Yeah.
Kesey was manipulated by these military folks and the pranksters with that bus. And so they end up promoting acid with that magical mystery tour type, that album, promoting the bus, like magical
Sergeant
bus.
Pepper. You can tell when they started using LSD.
Right. Yeah, and then 67, he says, he thought it was making him lose his mind, and so he got away from it. He said, he told Jan Wenner, Rolling Stone magazine, for a year or two, he just completely got away from it, and then Yoko Ono and his publicist, and I show the evidence that they were both intelligence connected.
Yeah. Yeah.
The publicist for sure, and then Yoko Ono convinced him to take acid again. And he takes acid again, and he says he's throwing up before concerts. He's so nervous to play concerts. Throwing up for hours, he said. And so his head is seriously messed up by the acid. His emotional control was seriously messed up by the acid. And yet, here's these people convincing him to keep taking it. And it's very sad. So Yoko, it came out, a close friend of Yoko's and John said, just in the last few years, 5 years, 6 years ago, they came out with a memoir that this guy came out with a memoir saying that Yoko introduced John to heroin. Heroin is just another easy way to control someone.
Yeah.
And so John developed that heroin habit. Monkey on his back. Everyone's got something to hide except me and my monkey. And that was about the monkey on his back, the heroin addiction. And so it's the ugly ways and so I did talk to someone who was researching John Lennon up a storm for a book. And she says she has tons of information about how deep it goes with Yoko Ono and her intelligence connections. I didn't, that was after I already came out with, or maybe just before I came out with it, or just after whatever I came out with CI Drugs Are Us.
Yeah.
So it's too bad, I couldn't even get all that. But basically, it's there's loads there on Yoko, and it just matches parallels too many other relationships where they use the husband or the wife or the girlfriend or the boyfriend to set people up, to manipulate them, control them, and all
Is this
that.
a book, John? Is this a book that we can get or tell others about?
By the woman who
Yeah.
wrote, I haven't heard her come out with it yet, sadly enough.
Okay. Okay.
But so basically, John Lennon was supporting the Black Panthers when they gave him the Merv Griffin show for a week. He had Bobby Seale from the national founder of the Black Panthers on there. He was a total anti-war activist, and so for those kinds of reasons, he was a threat to the super racist, really pro-war powers that be, the wealthiest families in the country.
Yep. Yep. Well, we only have a few minutes left here. I want to kind of.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do another interview with you sometime for sure.
Yeah.
But I'll just say, if you want to talk about Cobain at all, obviously I've got so much on him too.
Yeah. Well, what my question is what I'm really interested in is your take fast forward to today.
Sure.
Do you see this war still playing out? And
Yeah.
this is the second part of this question. I've been really investigating and looking into psychedelics, and now all of a sudden the medical industry is coming out and saying, "Oh, these can help with depression and addiction and all this kind of stuff."
Right.
I know personally firsthand that some people that have taken ketamine and stuff like that, and it did actually help them. So to help people out there, how do we navigate this? How do we know what's medically viable could be a real deal, and how we're being manipulated by
Well,
them?
Matthew Perry from Friends, sure thought
Yeah.
he got a lot of help at first from that ketamine until he died. But
Yeah,
you know,
very suspiciously.
yeah, and so it just shows, though, how the psychiatrists, they're so confident in their antidepressants that they now say, no, take ketamine for depression, or take
Yeah.
psychedelic mushrooms for depression.
Yeah.
That's how confident they are in their antidepressants. Forget Zoloft and Prozac. Take these psychedelics now. So it's just, could they help in some way? Maybe. Is it worth taking acid for depression or whatever the hell or trauma or whatever? Yeah, the side effects aren't good. Is it worth risking? Look, maybe if it helps you, great. If it doesn't, but I think it hurts. When I counseled a 16-year-old precocious young woman in Baltimore, used to go to be a child actor in these Baltimore theaters, and she said it was so easy to remember her lines all the time. She would look at the script once, and she could remember. She had great memory. After microdosing with acid a few times at 16, she couldn't remember anything anymore.
Wow.
I don't remember her lines anymore. I had that experience when I first started taking acid. I couldn't remember. I used to be able to just read a page and could remember it and write a page of a paper and one thing just in my head. I could see the whole page, write it all in my head, and then pick up the pen and write it all out because I'm older. I used a pen back then, write papers.
Yeah.
And so this is ugly stuff. Who wants that side effect? And, so it's just like, it's really, I found a show in CIA Drugs Are Us, there's the links, and in Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the book, that there's links between MKUltra and the current funders of all this research on psychedelics. It's talking about the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, the Heffter Institute. Those are two big funders of all these studies all over the world, and in these prestigious schools like Johns Hopkins and Harvard and all that, they're being funded by these billionaires. Rockefellers fund both those groups, MAPS and Heffter Institutes, and others, Pritzker family or family billionaires, etc.
Yeah.
And so it's the same people funding these things, and so don't trust them. And meanwhile, it's just in CIA Drugs Are Us, I cover the fact that they use all kinds of institutions still. Like I do trauma counseling for a living. So I use something called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is non-invasive.
Yep.
And so I've counseled some of Father Joseph Maskell's victims. Okay. And it's, and so in CI Drugs Are Us, I interview a particular victim who didn't mind going public about it all. And she wasn't one of my clients, but I've interviewed her. She talked about it all. She said, I saw LSD on the tablet that he put in my Coke before he put in my Coke all the time. And so that's with part of what they use, same modus operandi. One of my clients experienced this stuff in the early 90s with Father Maskell. And now I also experience sexual abuse and physical abuse of people that are in the churches around in my neighborhood, and I counsel them, and they're pastors. Like they're in a Catholic school. They got raped by a guy. This guy I was counseling got raped by another older guy in the bathroom, and tells the pastor, and he brushes it off. And that's some of the stuff going on. It's still going on today. And
in the church, that's the worst place.
The church schools. And so I argue that these are still the techniques using trauma and drugs and hypnosis. They're still being used today, and MKUltra is still going on today. And even though in Baltimore had a attorney general did a investigation of all this church sex abuse, and this came out because of the Keepers, that docuseries that I cover in my film CIA Drugs and Us. It caused this massive investigation. They listed like 130 different corrupt pastors who were legitimately abused people. They didn't charge any of them with anything.
Crazy.
They listed them as credibly accused of abuse of kids, didn't charge any of them. And so that just shows that someone more powerful kept them from charging anyone. And who's the most powerful is obviously U.S. intelligence, and that's the way this stuff seems to work.
Yeah. Well, John, we could go so many places. And Lindsay, I know he said he could go, but I mean, I was just sitting here thinking about the whole implications of we've been doing investigations with Scientology and the Process Church and their use of drugs. It is a very deep rabbit hole, and it started a lot earlier than I think people realize too, and from World War II and even back then. But
well, we didn't even get into the opium wars. We'll have to talk about that next time you come on.
Sure.
Yep. Yeah, we would love to do that. Is there anything, John, you'd like to finish off for our listeners that you'd like to let them know about that they can be careful of or aware of, or that they need to know?
Yeah, sure. Just be very careful about what you put in your body, any which way, and just try to stay healthy, exercise, do healthy things, enjoy music, but enjoy the sex and the rock and roll without the drugs, But if you're gonna use drugs, be very careful. Make sure they're legal, medicinal or safe or whatever, not somewhere from the streets, because they're spiking weed with all kinds of crap.
Fentanyl is the big thing now.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it was good talking to you guys. If people want to find out more about my books and films, it's my website's johnpotash.com, and you can find out more about the books and films there. They're all available on places like Barnes & Noble, Amazon.
You working on another book, or is there anything else project coming out or anything?
Well, I'm working on Shots 2. I did the first film, Shots, Eugenics to Pandemics, and I'm working on a part, like a sequel to that.
Yeah, that's another whole thing we could dive into. I'd love to dive into it. Yep. So, well, thank you so much. We appreciate you being on the show.
Pleasure, guys. I look forward to talking to you again anytime you'd like.
Thanks for listening and supporting us. And remember, stay naturally supernatural.